CEO's baby cried all night, but what the poor neighbor girl did shocked him. The mansion stood tall against the night sky, its grand windows glowing faintly under the moonlight. From the outside, it looked perfect, like a symbol of wealth and security. But inside, the walls carried echoes of pain and sleepless nights. Michael, the CEO, known for his power and sharp decisions, was not the same man when the sun went down. He walked through endless hallways, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion. And in his arms, tiny Sophie cried endlessly, her voice piercing the silence of the mansion. Michael rocked her gently, whispering words he never thought he would say aloud. "Please, Sophie. Just rest for a while," he murmured with trembling lips. The nursery was filled with toys, soft blankets, and expensive cribs, yet none of it could comfort the little girl. Her cries were not for luxury, but for the warmth she had lost. Her mother's absence had left a void no riches could ever replace. Michael leaned against the edge of the crib, pressing his forehead into his hand, his eyes burning from the sleepless nights that had piled into weeks. Business reports sat unopened on his desk, calls from board members went unanswered. The man who once controlled empires now struggled to soothe a single child. The mansion's staff whispered among themselves in the corridors. They admired his devotion, but none dared to step too close, for behind his stern face lay grief so raw it silenced even the boldest servant. Sophie's small fists clenched as she wailed, her cheeks red and damp with tears. Michael carried her to the rocking chair by the window. He swayed back and forth, hoping movement would calm her. Outside, the garden lights flickered, casting shadows across the floor. Michael's heart tightened as he thought of the woman who once stood by that very window. His wife's laughter seemed to echo faintly, as if the walls remembered what he wanted to forget. "You'd know how to calm her," he whispered into the darkness. The rocking chair creaked with every motion. Sophie's cries softened for a moment, then rose again, sharper than before. Michael closed his eyes, exhaustion pressing down like a weight. His tailored shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened carelessly, but he no longer cared about appearances. In those nights he wasn't a CEO, he was simply a father, desperate and broken. He laid Sophie gently in her crib and turned on the soft lullaby music box. The melody drifted through the air, sweet and fragile. Sophie whimpered, her tiny eyes blinking in the dim light. For a brief second, Michael thought she might finally fall asleep, but the silence broke once more as her cries returned louder than before. His chest ached, not from anger but from helplessness. He picked her up again, pacing the room with heavy steps. The mansion felt colder each night, despite its beauty. Chandeliers sparkled above him, mocking his emptiness. Golden frames lined the walls, displaying portraits of power and success, yet those same walls had never felt so hollow. Sophie's cries carried through the endless corridors. Somewhere, the servants stirred, listening quietly, but no one dared enter without permission. Michael's pride kept him from asking for help. He wanted to believe he could do this on his own, but as hours passed, his strength weakened. He sat at the edge of the bed, cradling Sophie against his chest. Her small heartbeat pressed against his, fragile yet insistent. Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away. The world had seen him as unbreakable, but here, in this nursery, he was just a man. The clock ticked past midnight, minutes turning into hours. Michael hummed softly, his voice rough from lack of rest. The lullaby was off-key, but it was filled with love. Sophie's cries slowed, then began again with renewed force. Michael groaned, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what else to do, Sophie," he whispered. His shoulders slumped as he stood once more. He carried her through the mansion's vast corridors. The marble floors reflected the soft light of chandeliers. Paintings of ancestors stared down at him, silent witnesses to his struggle. He stopped by the grand piano in the lounge. His wife had once played it while Sophie listened from her crib. He pressed a single key, the note ringing out into the emptiness. Sophie's cries faltered, her tiny eyes lifting toward the sound. Michael sat at the piano, holding her with one arm, his other hand stumbling across the keys, producing uneven notes. Still, Sophie quieted for a brief moment, listening. His heart swelled with both pain and hope. "She hears you too," he murmured to the memory of his wife. But as quickly as it came, the calm slipped away. Sophie wailed once more, desperate and restless. Michael sighed, pressing his lips against her forehead, his tears finally falling, soaking into her soft hair. "I miss her too," he whispered brokenly. The night stretched endlessly, without mercy. The mansion, though filled with luxury, felt like a prison. Every chandelier, every golden frame reminded him of what he had lost. Sophie's cries filled the silence, refusing to be ignored. Michael's arms ached from holding her, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. She was all he had left of her. In his exhaustion, he drifted toward the library. Books lined the shelves, untouched for weeks. He sat in the leather chair, rocking Sophie in his lap. The smell of old paper mixed with the faint scent of Sophie's baby lotion. His eyes closed for just a second, but her cries jolted him awake. He stood again, determined not to surrender. His steps carried him back to the nursery. The soft nightlight glowed in the corner. He laid Sophie down once more, staying close this time. His hand rested gently on her chest, feeling each fragile breath. Her cries softened to whimpers, then to tiny hiccups. Michael leaned closer, whispering, "Daddy's here. I won't leave you." The words cracked with emotion, but they were true. For the first time that night, Sophie's eyes fluttered with weariness. Michael held his breath, afraid to move. The nursery grew quiet, almost peaceful. He sat by the crib, unwilling to leave her side. His own body begged for rest, but his heart wouldn't allow it. He thought of the promises he had made to his wife, that he would protect Sophie no matter what, that he would give her all the love she deserved. And yet, love felt so fragile in moments like this. Sophie stirred again, but this time her cries were faint. Michael stroked her tiny hand with his finger. She gripped it tightly, holding on as if to remind him she needed him. His heart swelled, breaking and healing at once. "We'll get through this together," he whispered. The clock struck 3 in the morning. Michael sat there, still awake, still watching over her. The mansion was silent again, but this silence was different. It was filled not with despair, but with the fragile bond between father and daughter, and though sleep never came, love kept him standing. Michael sat in the nursery as the clock ticked toward dawn, his eyes heavy but his heart still alert, unwilling to surrender to sleep while Sophie rested unevenly in her crib. For days he had ordered every solution money could buy. State-of-the-art cribs designed with gentle vibrations, expensive lullaby machines imported from Europe, and a mountain of toys that filled the corners of the room. Each device promised rest, each invention guaranteed peace. But Sophie's cries seemed immune to every invention. The walls of the mansion were filled with more gadgets than a hospital, yet none could soothe her tiny soul. Nannies came and went, women with years of experience trained to care for the restless. They carried soothing voices and careful arms, but Sophie rejected them all. The moment another hand touched her, her cries grew louder, her face turning red with distress, her little fists clenching until she was safely back in Michael's hold. The wealthy man, who once dismissed weakness, now understood fragility through the sound of his daughter's voice. He had thought that surrounding her with professionals would bring her comfort, but instead it reminded him of how irreplaceable her mother's presence had been. Nights turned into long battles of patience and exhaustion, where Michael found himself whispering words he had never spoken to anyone, words of comfort, of promises, of hope he wasn't sure he could fulfill. He pressed his lips to Sophie's forehead and murmured, "You're safe, little one. I'll never let anything happen to you." His whispers were filled with truth, yet also with cracks of sorrow that broke him further inside. In the daylight, Michael still played his role as the untouchable CEO. He appeared in crisp suits before his employees, signed contracts, and gave orders with authority, but no one could see the storm he carried behind his eyes. When the meetings ended and the handshakes faded, he returned to a house that tested him more than any boardroom ever could. Sophie's cries had no respect for deadlines, no understanding of exhaustion, and no pause for wealth. They cut through the silence like tiny thunderclaps, shattering his pride each night. He would sit by her crib, the glow of the nightlight casting shadows across his tired face, his eyes fixed on her restless body, as if his presence alone could protect her from nightmares she couldn't even name. Sometimes he reached for books on parenting that he had ordered, pages filled with advice and techniques, but none of them spoke to the ache he felt in his chest. None told him how to ease the emptiness Sophie felt without her mother. He tried singing, though his voice cracked with strain. He tried humming old tunes, though he barely remembered the melodies. At times he simply sat in silence, his fingers brushing the crib rails, waiting for her cries to soften on their own. The servants offered suggestions: warm milk, softer blankets, a different position, but every method failed. Michael refused to let frustration overtake him. Instead, he let patience grow where pride had once lived. Each tear Sophie shed felt like a wound to his soul, and every time her tiny hands clutched his finger, he felt a desperate plea for love that no wealth could substitute. The man who once believed control was everything now faced the truth that love was the only power left to him. The battles of the night stretched longer than he imagined possible, testing him more than any hostile takeover or corporate war. He would sit hunched in the chair, his tie discarded, his hair disheveled, whispering to Sophie promises of tomorrow, of days when the crying would end, of mornings filled with sunshine instead of sorrow. His voice trembled as he said, "I'll figure it out, Sophie. I'll make this better. Somehow, I'll give you peace." But inside, he feared he was failing her, feared that no matter how much he gave, it would never be enough. The mansion grew lonelier with each attempt that failed, its halls echoing not with laughter, but with the weary sighs of a father trying to be both parent and comfort. Sometimes Michael looked at the empty side of the bed where his wife used to sleep, and the weight of the missing presence nearly crushed him. But when Sophie's cries cut through the silence, he rose again, fueled by something stronger than grief, an unyielding love that demanded he keep fighting. His hands trembled, his voice faltered, but he never left her side. And though the nights dragged on like endless battles, Michael began to realize something he had never known before. Love was not in winning, but in enduring. And for Sophie, he would endure forever. The nights dragged on until one evening, when Michael's exhaustion weighed heavier than ever. A sound unlike Sophie's crying came from the front of the mansion. A knock, soft but steady, cutting through the silence like a strange answer to his prayers. He hesitated, wondering who could possibly come at such an hour, and after placing Sophie gently back into her crib, he walked down the grand staircase, his steps echoing across the marble floor. The knock came again, more hesitant this time, almost apologetic. When Michael pulled the heavy door open, he was met not with a colleague, not with a servant, but with a sight that startled him. A young woman, dressed plainly in worn jeans and a faded sweater, stood on his doorstep with her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Her hair was tied back carelessly, her eyes carrying both fear and determination, as though it had taken her every ounce of courage to be standing there. Michael's brows furrowed as he studied her, unused to strangers intruding into his carefully guarded world. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone tired but firm, his voice still carrying the weight of authority even after sleepless nights. The girl swallowed, glancing past him into the grand hall before returning her gaze to the floor. I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," she stammered, her voice soft and unsure. "But I hear your baby crying every night." Michael stiffened, his pride bristling at the thought of his private struggles spilling into the world outside his mansion walls. Yet there was no mockery in her tone, no judgment, only genuine concern, mixed with something fragile that Michael couldn't place. She shifted her weight, clutching her hands tighter as she whispered, "I live next door, in the apartment building. The walls are thin and sometimes it sounds like she's in pain." Her words lingered in the cool night air, not as an accusation, but as a plea. Michael glanced past her toward the dimly lit street where the run-down building stood in stark contrast to his towering estate. He looked back at the girl, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness that mirrored his own, and for a brief moment he wondered why she cared. "And what exactly do you want?" he asked carefully, masking the vulnerability that threatened to break through his voice. Emily shifted again, her throat tightening as she tried to find the right words. I just thought maybe I could help. I know it's not my place, but I've taken care of children before. My mother's sick and I need work. But mostly, I just can't sleep hearing her cry and knowing she's hurting." Her voice cracked at the end, betraying both her honesty and her desperation. Michael stared at her, caught between suspicion and curiosity. For years, people had come to him for money, for power, for favors, but never like this. This girl wasn't demanding, wasn't scheming. She was standing there trembling, as though stepping into his world was dangerous in itself. He could have turned her away. Pride told him to close the door, to protect his struggles from prying eyes. But something in Emily's expression stopped him. Something raw, something genuine, something that reminded him of a life he had almost forgotten. He let out a slow breath and finally asked, "What's your name?" She blinked, surprised that he hadn't sent her away, and replied softly, "Emily." The name lingered in the air between them, simple yet steady, as if it carried its own quiet strength. Michael's gaze lingered on her, still uncertain, but before he could decide what to do next, Sophie's cry rang out again from upstairs, sharp and demanding, filling the air with the very sound that had brought Emily here in the first place. Emily's eyes flickered toward the sound, her body tensing with instinct, as if her heart wanted to move before her mind could stop it. Michael noticed his own chest tightening with conflict, torn between protecting his pride and accepting help from a stranger who looked like she had little to offer but sincerity. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion dragging down his defenses, and stepped aside just slightly, enough to reveal the grand hallway behind him. "Come in," he said at last, his voice reluctant but laced with the faintest thread of hope. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her hands tightening at her sides, but she nodded and stepped carefully across the threshold, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. The mansion seemed to swallow her as she entered, its chandeliers and gilded walls towering over her simple figure. She looked out of place, like a fragile sketch drawn into a masterpiece, but her gaze didn't linger on the wealth around her. Instead, it lifted toward the staircase where Sophie's cries echoed once more, and in that moment, her plain clothes, her trembling hands, her poverty, none of it mattered. What mattered was the sound of a child who needed comfort, and the weary father who could no longer fight the battle alone. Emily's steps were quiet as she followed Michael up the staircase, her eyes drawn to the faint glow spilling from the nursery door, where Sophie's cries grew sharper with every passing second. Michael's movements were heavy, each step betraying the fatigue that weighed down his body, yet he moved with urgency, knowing his daughter needed him. When they entered the room, Sophie's little body twisted restlessly in her crib, her face damp with tears, her cries echoing like a sorrowful melody against the pastel-colored walls. Michael moved forward instinctively, but Emily's voice, soft and tentative, rose behind him. "May I try?" The words hovered in the air, fragile yet filled with an unfamiliar confidence. Michael turned to her, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. He had never trusted anyone outside his circle, especially not a stranger who had appeared at his door in plain clothes. Yet his exhaustion pressed on him like a weight too heavy to carry, and after a long moment of silence, he gave a single nod. Emily's heart raced as she stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly as she reached down. Sophie's cries wavered, sensing the shift, but continued with the same desperation. Emily gathered the tiny child gently in her arms, cradling her against her chest with a familiarity born not of luxury, but of love. Michael's jaw tightened as he watched, every muscle in his body on edge, yet too drained to intervene. Emily adjusted Sophie carefully, swaying in slow motions as though her body already remembered the rhythm of comfort. And then, with a breath that steadied her nerves, she began to sing. Her voice was not polished, not trained for grand stages, but it carried something no performance could ever hold: sincerity. A simple lullaby flowed from her lips, one she had sung countless nights to her younger siblings long ago when her family was whole and life was gentler. The melody wrapped around the room like a blanket, warm and unpretentious, reaching places that machines and riches never could. Michael's eyes widened slightly as he saw Sophie's cries soften, her sobs breaking into faint whimpers, her tiny fists unclenching as she clutched at Emily's dress with desperate trust. The sight struck him deeper than he expected, a wave of disbelief and relief crashing over him all at once. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb, watching as Emily's voice painted calm across his daughter's restless spirit. Sophie's breaths grew slower, her eyelids fluttering as if torn between resistance and surrender. Emily continued, her song weaving love and memory together, each note carrying the weight of nights she had once spent caring for children who depended on her. To Michael's astonishment, within minutes Sophie's cries faded into silence. Her head nestled against Emily's chest, her body finer, Ellie releasing its tension, and her tiny lips parted in peaceful sleep. The room, which had known nothing but wailing for weeks, now held a stillness so profound that Michael found himself holding his breath, afraid to break the fragile miracle before his eyes. He had tried everything: technology, nannies, expensive remedies, but none had succeeded. And here stood a girl with nothing but her voice and her heart, giving Sophie the one thing she had been searching for all along: comfort. Michael's throat tightened, emotions clashing within him. Pride urged him to resist, to question, to pull Sophie back into his arms, but gratitude swelled so strongly that it silenced every other thought. He watched as Emily swayed gently, her voice softening with each line of the lullaby until it was no more than a whisper. Sophie shifted once, gripping the fabric of Emily's dress with her tiny fingers before sinking deeper into sleep. The young woman lowered herself carefully into the rocking chair, still holding Sophie close, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief and something tender. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, as though he had stumbled upon a truth he wasn't ready to face. His mansion had been filled with everything money could buy, yet all along it had lacked this raw, human tenderness that cost nothing but meant everything. For the first time in weeks, the nursery was not a battlefield. It was quiet, serene, touched by a melody that carried no wealth yet held immeasurable value. Emily finally lifted her gaze, her voice fading as she whispered, "She's asleep." Michael's lips parted, but no words came, only silence heavy with awe. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together as he studied the girl who had done what he could not. A storm of thoughts ran through his mind, but all he could feel in that moment was the steady beat of gratitude pulsing in his chest, fragile and undeniable. Michael sat in silence, his gaze fixed on Sophie's peaceful face as the minutes passed, still unable to fully comprehend what he had witnessed. The mansion, once suffocating with cries, now rested in an almost sacred quiet, and in the middle of it sat Emily with Sophie curled safely against her chest. Something inside him shifted that night, something he hadn't felt in months, a fragile sense of hope. In the days that followed, Emily began to return. At first, Michael thought it might have been a one-time act of kindness, but the very next evening, when Sophie's cries rose again, a knock came at the door, soft and familiar. Without hesitation, he opened it, and there stood Emily, her tired eyes carrying the same mixture of courage and compassion. She walked into the nursery without question, and once more her voice carried through the room, tender and unpolished, but filled with warmth. Sophie responded the same way she had the first night, her cries fading, her little hands reaching out, her body sinking into the safety of Emily's arms. Night after night, the pattern repeated itself, and each time, Michael found himself standing a little longer by the doorway, not only watching his daughter find peace, but also studying the girl who had brought it. There was something unexplainable about her presence. She did not belong to his world of contracts, board meetings, and endless negotiations. Her world was small, fragile, and filled with burdens of its own, yet she carried a lightness, a kindness that no amount of wealth could ever purchase. Michael noticed how she never looked twice at the grandeur around her. The chandeliers, the velvet curtains, the gold-trimmed frames meant nothing to her. Her attention was always fixed solely on Sophie. That sincerity disarmed him in ways he didn't expect. Slowly he realized he began to wait for her visits, listening for the gentle knock as the night grew, Avi, feeling a sense of relief whenever she appeared at his door. It was no longer just about Sophie finding rest. It was about the quiet comfort Emily brought into a home that had been hollow for too long. Sometimes, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Emily would remain for a few minutes, sitting quietly in the rocking chair as the child's breathing grew steady. In those moments, Michael would find himself speaking, softly, cautiously, about things he never shared with anyone. He told her about Sophie's birth, about the way his wife had sung lullabies in the same chair now occupied by Emily, about the way grief had broken him when everything else in his life demanded strength. Emily never interrupted, never offered meaningless platitudes. She simply listened, her presence speaking louder than words. The more time she spent in the mansion, the more Michael began to see the cracks in his own armor. He had always believed that money could solve anything, but here was a truth he couldn't deny. Wealth had failed him in the most important battle of his life. And yet, a girl who owned so little had given him more than he could ever repay. Each night, when Emily's song filled the nursery, Michael felt his chest loosen, as though the walls that had imprisoned him were slowly falling away. He began to notice the details of her, how her voice softened on certain notes, how her eyes brightened when Sophie finally smiled in her sleep, how her hands trembled slightly after a long day yet still held Sophie with unwavering gentleness. These moments etched themselves into his heart, quietly, persistently, until he realized he wasn't just grateful anymore. He was moved. What Emily gave Sophie was beyond comfort. It was love, the kind of love that came freely, without expectation, without transaction. It was a bond that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with humanity. And as Michael stood night after night, watching the scene unfold, he understood that something far greater was forming, a connection not built on wealth or power, but on warmth, kindness, and the healing only a genuine heart could bring. Weeks slipped by, and the mansion that had once echoed only with silence and grief slowly transformed into something entirely different, something warm and alive. The heavy weight that had hung over Michael's home began to lift, replaced by the gentle rhythm of laughter, tiny footsteps, and the soft melodies that Emily often hummed without even realizing. What had started as an unexpected knock on the door had become a bond neither of them could deny, and in that bond, the emptiness of the mansion dissolved. Emily was no longer just the neighbor who sang Sophie to sleep. She was now part of their daily lives. She would come by in the mornings to help Sophie with her little routines, and Michael noticed how his daughter's face lit up the moment she saw Emily step through the doorway. Sophie reached for her, not out of need, but out of love, her tiny arms wrapping around Emily's neck as though she belonged there all along. In those moments, Michael felt a peace that words could never describe, a peace he had thought lost forever. The mansion itself seemed to respond to this change. The walls no longer felt suffocating, the silence no longer unbearable. Rooms that had been closed off were opened again, filled with life, laughter, and even the smell of simple meals Emily prepared when she stayed longer. Her presence carried a warmth that no luxurious decor could provide. Michael began to smile again, not the polite, practiced smile of a businessman, but the genuine kind that came from deep within. He found himself laughing when Sophie played with Emily, his heart swelling when he saw his daughter happy, safe, and loved. For the first time since his wife's passing, the mansion felt like a home rather than a cage. Emily's role was never one of servitude. She was never treated as staff. Instead, she became family, someone irreplaceable. Michael realized this as he watched her patiently teach Sophie small things, like how to clap her hands to a rhythm or point to her toys one by one. The girl who once stood nervously at his door had woven herself into the fabric of their lives, not through wealth or power, but through simple, selfless love. And it was in those ordinary moments that Michael discovered what he had been missing. No empire, no fortune, no possession had ever given him the kind of fulfillment he now felt as he sat in his own home, watching his daughter giggle and his heart heal. He understood now that the most priceless treasures were never bought. They were found in unexpected hearts, like Emily's. The mansion that once felt like a monument to his loneliness had become a sanctuary of love and belonging. Sophie thrived, Emily blossomed in her place at their side, and Michael, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, finally breathed without the weight of sorrow pressing down on him. In that newfound joy, he recognized a truth far greater than success or wealth, that family could be formed not only by blood but by love, and that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive uninvited, yet stay forever.